Alice in Wonderland, A Shifting History by Maggie Flanagan. Alice in Wonderland has a shifting history with many versions over time. Lewis Carroll made up this story for Alice Liddell on July 4, 1862. Dodgson decided to tell the story of a perplexed little girl who ventures into a curious wonderland, and the fantasy of Alice began, or so it goes. The story began as an oral tale, which is crucial to its history as well as future iterations. An oral tale is a live event that is both performative and spontaneous. It wasn't until February of 1863 that Carroll was finally able to write down the full text of his fictional tale. John Tenniel illustrated the first publication of Alice in Wonderland in 1865, with line drawings represented in a comical and almost satirical manner, many of which were based on Carroll's own drawings. In 1907, the version of Alice illustrated by Arthur Rackham entered the world with much controversy. The book was a reworking of the John Tenniel original with the same text and all new imagery. Rackham challenged the original illustrations by Tenniel and brought the illustrations into an intersection of the sentimental and the grotesque. This remake of the story paved the way for the many versions this story would take on over time. The reworking of original artwork forced the public to see this story in a new light. The viewer was able to make a comparison to the original while thinking about the plot line with a brand new visual. This allowed for later renditions by artists such as Salvador Dali in 1969 and Yayoi Kusama in 2012 to make their own versions of this story. In 1969, Salvador Dali illustrated his own versions of Alice in an extremely abstract manner. The illustrations are dreamy and light, with 12 heliogravures imitating watercolors on the page of each specific chapter. These illustrations do not visually represent anything that is happening in the storyline, but instead emit emotions and add feelings to the words on the page with splashes of color and blobby ink spots. This shift in illustration was made possible because the story had already lived so many lives on its own. The Dali book was released 18 years after the 1951 Disney movie had been created. The vast majority of the audience for this particular version of the story would already be extremely familiar with the plot line. This version of Alice is found in unbound folios, allowing the owner of the book to pull out the pages without damaging the book and use them as individual images, almost like a perfectly packaged gallery exhibition, shifting the audience of the story from the children it was created to entertain to adults in the fine art world. The original version of Alice shows a poem in the shape of a mouse's tail. The image portrays the poem in a winding and shifting manner, creating a reading experience for the viewer that is much more complicated than a typical left-to-right reading experience. The 1907 Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, illustrated by Rackham, holds the same concrete poem. The poem appeared again and again in Kusama and Dali's artist renditions, as well as many versions found around the world. A concrete poem is any poetry that is shaped in a way that changes or adds to the meaning of the words held within it. This shows a relationship of text and image by the changing of the words on the page to become text as image. The repetition of this shaped poem is extremely interesting when considering the iterations this book has taken on. The poem almost functions as an allegory for the book itself, showing both the ways the book has changed over time, as well as the moments that it has held true to its original form. Alice has lived many lives, with the shift from satirical images by Tenniel to a fairy tale-like narrative by Rackham. Dali takes the story into the realm of abstraction, and Disney makes it entirely animated for children, removing it from the form of the book altogether. From here, we see a shift into a dark and moody 2010 film by Tim Burton, where a deeply saddened and lost Johnny Depp plays the Mad Hatter. My original interest in the long tail continues on with each version of the story that I find. So far, every version of Alice that I have found that includes this chapter also includes the concrete poem. While the shape varies slightly, and the words within the poem also make shifts or variations, the general idea remains the same. These tracked a shifting in the book over time, as well as a consistency of this particular way of telling a story. The oral manner of Alice's origin story allowed it to take on many transitions from 1865 until the present time. With each change in the version of this story, the meaning of the content shifts as well. When we view this story as a Disney movie, we can take away different morals and visuals than when we read the Dali version in a special collections library. The viewing experience, as well as the actual illustrations, change something about the story itself. This begs me, the artist and printmaker, to participate in the collection of various visuals attached to this universal narrative. Through my exploration, I have begun layering and inverting the page showing the concrete mouse poem. I have mocked up versions of this tale by scanning the pages right out of the books and into Photoshop. This allows me to digitally layer the images to mimic the transparent layers of the proposed final screen-printed form. Tracking the poem and its shifts over time shows the book's long life and the interests of many artists, including myself, to take part in the tradition of Alice. I am interested in taking this particular poem and using it to represent Alice as a whole. As the book has moved throughout history, I no longer find it necessary to reproduce the entire book. Just as Rackham forced the public to understand the story with new imagery, and Dali asked the audience to think about abstraction within the story, I ask you to view this winding and layered print as a complete and holistic representation of Alice herself, as well as the mouse's tail.